To wrap up our panel discussion and sharing of stories, we'll have a Q&A session afterwards if you'd like to ask some questions about our panel's stories or their immigration experiences here in Chattanooga, maybe things that you might do in your local circles of influence that might be a positive impact. You'll have the opportunity to do that. I would like to now introduce our historian, Dr. Lisa Diller.
You know, the famous saying, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. That's kind of part of why I'm here, I guess, is for a variety of reasons. But first, I do also want to add my gratitude to Deborah. I moved to Chattanooga in 2002, and the Women's Council on Diversity had just formed then in a very needed time. And it was the way that I actually got connected to the city of Chattanooga. I moved here to take a job as a historian from Chicago. I come down, didn't know anybody very much in the city other than my colleagues, and really appreciated that community. When you have a community of people that are around that kind of idea, which has been expressed many times here, it was a hugely useful thing to me. So thank you very much for everything you've done for Chattanooga. Deborah, I appreciate that. I'm a historian of the early modern world, which means I studied before there were nation states, when everyone was crossing borders. So one of the major things that I think it's important for my students to learn is there's no pure people anywhere. Everyone was always moving. That's just what we do. We move and we procreate as we move. So there's no kind of nice tightness to those borders around there. And so I study the Atlantic world and in the 1400s to the 1700s, the Mediterranean world, and it's just a glorious mashup. It's fantastic. So getting to hear these stories, I keep kind of making all of those connections. Historians collect stories over time. We're here listening to some stories, and what historians do is we try to take those stories that are individual on their own and say something kind of collectively about them. And sometimes we do that with more or less success. But what's interesting, people like to say history repeats itself, but these stories don't repeat themselves. Everybody is different, and their stories are all different, even though we might come up with some commonalities or some common themes. So when we think about this, I don't know very much, actually. It might seem like horrifying as a historian. I actually don't know very much about my family history. I'm pretty sure we were immigrants at one point in the past. Pretty sure that's the case. We've moved. But I do love crossing borders. I love crossing boundaries. It's exciting, it's dangerous, and it throws you off a little to be in a place where you're sure you're going to mess up. Where your culture, you're gonna be rude because you don't know the culture, and that's an important place to be. Important point of humility, to submit yourself to learning from another people, another group. You don't get learning another language where you're gonna sound like an idiot for a while, and none of us want to do that. And so those are important things for me. When we talk about the history of immigration in Chattanooga. When we talk about crossing borders, if immigration is crossing from one country to another, this city was founded, the first immigrants to Chattanooga were the European Americans in the 1830s who replaced the deported exiled Cherokee and basically moved to what had been a different country until that point. The next wave of migrants that we see, not so much immigrants, but again, people who were trying to cross borders, were the African Americans who followed the Northern Army in the 1860s. And women were a very large part of that group of African Americans who settled in Chattanooga after the Civil War. By 1870, about 3% of Chattanooga was foreign-born, almost entirely from Europe. We have these kinds of census records, mostly from Ireland. We had Irish Hill here. That was kind of a big point. A lot of Irish workers that came down for the railroads, but also as we move into the 1870s, 1880s, Chinese workers that came in to build the railroads in Alabama and the area around here. We had our first Asian immigrants at that point. The European demographics had shifted by the 1890s. The largest single foreign-born group was from Germany, as opposed to being from the British Isles. Immigrant women, while moving in the 19th century in slightly smaller numbers than the men, or sometimes in years following the male members of their family, played vital roles as we all know, in every society that they were part of. They raised money for their children to go to school with. They contributed to religious organizations that they started. They supported charities to support their fellow immigrants. They helped move the economy forward. And as in the 1920s, 1910s, 20s, as Chattanooga became the dynamo of Dixie with flourishing industries, women, and especially immigrant women, provided important labor, especially in manufacturing around here. And the unions that did organize here, actually in Chattanooga, it's hard to imagine that, but that happened before the Great Depression. The Knights of Labor, for instance, was a union that would allow women, single women, to join it. And so women were part of the labor organizations here. World War I is when we see a massive decline in immigration. Between World War I and 1965, with the Immigration Act of 1965, this is like the low point. It's amazing when you look at these charts for immigration in U.S. history. It's just like this. And this is when we have kind of the sociologists like to discover, you know, sort of people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, kind of the whitening of ethnic diversity within the United States. So we had racial problems, we did have ethnic diversity, but the sort of ethnic divisions that we'd seen in the 19th century sort of flattened out. And we have people talking about Protestant, Catholic, Jew as sort of being the big difference within your kind of generic whiteness in the United States. And that was something that the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 really changed. And then it seemed very alarming to people in the United States that all of a sudden there's a bunch of immigration, even though it had not been that long, you know, just a couple generations before where we'd had some of that. What the Immigration Act of 1965 did in some ways, though, was limit immigration from the Western Hemisphere. And that meant that there were a lot more people who could come from nearby but couldn't do so legally. And that was a problem. The other thing that act did is make it more possible for families to be joined together. So we started having a big increase in women that are coming as part of immigration. And we have an almost inversion by between 1970 and today. 85% of the immigrants have come from Asia and Central and South America, as opposed to Europe, 10% or so from Europe, from France, or from other places. So a big inversion. We did have, I was looking at some of the statistics for foreign-born in 1970. No, I guess that was actually in the 1970. We had a big chunk of the foreign-born in the Chattanooga area specifically were from the USSR. That was kind of an exotic part of Europe that we had. So again, by far the biggest kind of change in immigration for Chattanooga comes from the highly skilled people that come afterwards. And the women that we have here today are a big example of that. And so we have women who are coming both to go to school and immigrants and who are being recruited to serve in our industries, the medical industry, our educational industries, our corporate industries. And so like all immigrants, women kind of really contribute to this. And when we study immigration, kind of back up, if we were having a conversation about immigration in 1900, for instance, we wouldn't, first of all, be listening to the stories of the immigrants themselves. We would be talking about them probably as a problem to be solved, instead of as people who are helping us solve our problems, which is how we see them today. And if we were talking about women immigrants in 1900, we would probably be talking about them as, again, a problem, perhaps competitors for husbands, as people who need to be taught how to be moral, how to be mothers. And now we're looking at them as professionals, as people who are teaching us a great deal. So listening to immigrant stories is important for us, though, because when we learn about people who come to our city, whether from other parts of the United States or from other countries, we learn a lot more about what our society is like, especially what our economy is like. And there's no way to talk about immigration without bringing up race and ethnicity. Our immigrant women have to make their way through identity categories that they may or may not have chosen for themselves, but for which they are considered to be representatives. Our immigrant women may be asked to speak on behalf of the regions from which they came, whether they want to or not. And one of their contributions is that they connect us to the rest of the world. One of the great quotes from Raquel Cepeda's Bird of Paradise, How I Became Latina, is, "Foisting an identity on people rather than allowing them the freedom and space to create their own is shady." But we do it all the time. Ultimately, one of the compelling reasons we love hearing stories from immigrants, which has already been stated, is about the risks. We love to hear from people who are being intentional. They're here on purpose. Someone made a decision. for women from all places, native-born as well as those who cross borders to get here, being able to make choices and invent ourselves, to create space for ourselves, this is deeply attractive. And we celebrate this in Women's History Month. We're grateful for these women who've joined us here in Chattanooga as we make our city on purpose and braid our stories together so we can grow and extend the story of Chattanooga to reflect all of our strengths.